Hi, I'm Frank Statham, and I live in Cobble Hill on Vancouver Island. I started my career in electronics when I was a teenager. I got interested. I found some old scrap pieces of wire and started making magnets and things like that with it. And by the time I was in high school, I was lucky enough to go to Burnaby Central, where there was a full-fledged electronics program, similar to a woodworking program, or in that school there was a automotive shop program. So I took the electronics under a fellow by the name of David Lloyd George Powell, so you can tell who his mother liked. But anyhow, it was a really good course. And from there, I stepped into British Columbia Institute of Technology and got a diploma in electronics communications. And I graduated in 1967. And from there, I joined the Department of Transport. My first position with the Department of Transport, I wound up working in the Sinclair building for a month while they figured out what to do with me. So then they asked me if I wanted to go to Sandspit, and I had no idea where Sandspit was, but I wound up in the DC-6 and spent the summer of 1967 working at the Sandspit Airport. At that time, the Sandspit Airport had a marine and an air radio station built into it, and I was there for 4 or 5 months. I left there and went down to the regional office in Vancouver again. I wound up for a month or two at Vancouver Airport working at the old air traffic systems building. From there, I wound up going over to the Victoria Electronics Workshop. And from there, I spent the rest of my working career. The Victoria Electronics Workshop maintained all the vessel electronics for the Coast Guard fleet. It looked after the maintenance and staffing of Victoria Coast Guard Radio out in Sook. It looked after the staffing and maintenance at Tofino Airport and radio station. It looked after Patricia Bay, the air radio station there, plus the NavAids, and it also looked after Nanaimo Airport. It also had the other stations like at Port Hardy under its wing, but that was sort of not staffed directly by us. We looked after all the aeronautical beacons on the island at that time and all the lighthouse stations and their HF radios. And associated with the electronic shop were various ships, the weather ships in particular. We'd disappear over the horizon to Ocean Station Papa for 7 weeks at a time. There was 2 ships and we alternated trips. I did 4 of those trips. I also did 2 trips on the icebreaker Camsell. She would head up into the Arctic and break the ice for the supply ships coming down the Mackenzie River from Hay River. The Hay River was the end of track, and all the supplies for the remote communities along the northern coast of Canada, on the western Arctic at least, would be brought down the Mackenzie River by barge, and the icebreaker would fall ahead of the tugs and the barges, clearing a path if required. And the icebreaker would go all the way east to Joe Haven. It's got a new name now, but I can't think of what it is. It's in the indigenous tongue. So I made 2 of those trips. They were 3 months each. I made other trips to the Arctic, but they weren't as long. I came back once on the Martha L. Black. I was on the delivery crew for the Coast Guard ship Nahidik. She was a riverboat, flat bottom, designed to work in the river. And I joined that ship in Prince Rupert and went across, hugging the coast all the way up around Point Barrow and down the coast to Tuktoyaktuk. And there I made a mistake. I phoned the office and asked if I should be coming back, and they said yes. If I had kept my mouth shut, I would have had a nice trip up the Mackenzie River, and I lost that opportunity. During that time, during my time in Victoria, I also worked at Hay River in the spring, getting the ships ready for the summer season, because the ships would more or less be left to freeze into the ice. There was no heat or anything on the vessel, so that took a bit going. One year, to our surprise, I went on to the Dumet, and I couldn't get the fluorescent lights on. Then I realized that the fluorescent lights don't work in cold temperatures. But anyhow, what I was going to tell you is I went into the engine room to find out why, and I went about 2 steps down into the engine room ladder, and there was water. the ship had frozen to the bottom, and as the river came up during the breakup season, the engine's room got flooded. But they had that ship ticking over within about 3 weeks. It worked really good. So I did, 2 trips for that. We also drove across from Hay River to Fort McMurray. There was a small ship there. Well, it'll come to me later. And we get that ship put back in the water too. In Fort McMurray was a vessel called the Miskinaw, the mighty Miskinaw. And what surprised me once, because I was unfamiliar with the shallow draft vessels, was going down the Clearwater River. I think that was the name of the river that fed into the Athabasca River. And we steamed past a guy who was in water up to his chest. That's something you wouldn't see on the West Coast. And the names of those ships up there, they all meant Pathfinder in English. The Miskinaw, the Dumat, and the other vessels that will come to mind later, I'm sure. When I was in 1974, I won a promotion to work in the regional office, and I was for 4 years the marine maintenance officer, and that entailed any vessel or any coast station problems that couldn't be handled in the field. They'd come to me, and I'd handle them. That lasted 4 years, and then I broke myself down to a working tech again and went back to Victoria. I found I was leaving my family alone too much, a lot of traveling. How did I become interested in researching the coastal radio? Maybe I should mention that I have a website, roughradio.ca. That's Rough Radio, because running a radio station in the early days, 1908, was very, very difficult. And I wound up researching that and made a website out of it because I came into work one day, but I guess it was just after Victoria Radio shut down, and there was typewritten sheets lying on my desk. Didn't know at the time where they came from, but it was a history of the West Coast radio system written by somebody named Bowerman. And it was a very interesting read. So I started thinking, and it was at the bottom, I had a fellow's name, Ian Haynes. And I found out he was a local chap, and I rang him up, and he turned out to be the nephew of this Jack Bowerman, and he said he had several cartons of old photo albums that I could come down and look and digitize if I so felt like it. So I went down and spoke to him, and I digitized all the album pages I found that were of interest. And by golly, there was a lot of interesting stuff. Some of the faces in there from Bowerman, let me see, I should mention, Bowerman started about 1912 or so in the coast stations. He was at all the new coast stations. By new, I mean like as they started up. And he took photographs while he was there. But he didn't really annotate any of the photographs, which was a little annoying. But over the years, I figured out who some of the people were, and lo and behold, I worked with their sons over when I first started, so I sort of missed that opportunity to talk to their sons and get more information. But anyhow, Bowerman started me off, and then I wound up in the Victoria Library with the old microfilms, reeling, starting at as early as I could, 1907, and reading each paper, looking for information on these websites, on the newspapers, articles about the stations being installed and run up and commissioned. And it just grew like topsy from there. I started out with just a couple of hundred photographs, and then I found out, or I got an email from somebody saying, well, that's my uncle you're talking about. I've got some photographs here, and do you want them? So, okay, please. And the whole thing just sort of grew like topsy. And it's just grown like that. It's taken on a life of its own. The people, I have the staff members in there, I must have a couple of hundred now. I've got their names. In many cases, I got their photographs. And I can track their movements through the newspapers because online now, the papers are all digitized, of course. I can track a person just by banging their name in. And amazingly, in the bad old days, the people's, if they came into Victoria and stayed at a hotel, the names would be printed the next day in the newspaper. You can't see that happening today. So there'd be a name like, I don't know, Jack Bowerman's in from Bull Harbor. And so I'd know he was in Bull Harbor at that particular date. and it carried on like that. In the early days, there was no, there was telegraph across the continent, but what the newspaper offices would do if any ship came in, and in those days there were a lot of passenger ships from the Orient would come in, the first thing a reporter would do is go down to the ship that had just come in, grab all the newspapers and take them back to the office and read them and put the newspaper clippings into the current edition of the newspaper. That was one way that the news was brought up. The first stations, there was 5 of them were installed, and they were installed fairly quickly. There was a lot of shipwrecks along the Strait of Juan de Fuca and further up the coast. It was a pretty grim place to sail a ship. There were lighthouses, but in the days of sailing, the winds tended to blow to the northeast. And of course, trying to get into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which points to the southwest, was rather difficult. There used to be a tug station out there, and if any sailing ship needed trouble or was in trouble or needed help getting in to Seattle or Victoria, the tug would pull them in. But nevertheless, they'd get confused. They'd get confused and wind up sailing into Barkley Sound instead of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So there's horrible losses of life and cargo. So the federal government decided to do something about it, and they built the life-saving trail. That was a trail along from Port Renfrew up to Bamfield. It was 6 or 8 feet wide, had ladders going up and down over ravines. Life-saving, there was cabins along the way with food and blankets and wood and, keep the shipwreck crew cozy. And there's a crank phone and instructions in various languages. So that trail went in. There was a couple of lifeboats went in, the life-saving. There's one at Bamfield. I think there's one at Ucluelet, which moved around to Tofino. The third thing that went in was the radio stations. The radio station was installed at Estevan, way up the coast there. Another one was installed at Pachina. Another one installed on top of Gonzales Hill in Victoria. There's one on the cliffs of Point Grey, and there's another one at Point Lazo. So during the winter, during the Christmas season, actually December and January 1907, 1908, these stations were commissioned, and the way things went from there. In those days, the early spark transmitters were very, very crude. Like at Estevan Point, the station went in before the lighthouse, and the station building was a long, thin thing. It had a diesel plant or gasoline plant which generated electricity, and electricity only for the spark transmitter, so normally the electricity wasn't running. At one end in the middle was the living quarters, and at the far end was the operation room. So I don't think I got much sleep, because every time a ship called up, the generator would start up. The operators hunched over coal oil lamps and copied messages. Basically, the transmitter, spark. Most of you have heard ignition noise in your car radio, tick, 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 while the engine's running. That's basically what a spark transmitter is, a high voltage jumping a spark. The receiver was basically fed from the long antenna wire into a little crystal, and then onto the headphones and to the ground. So it would pick up everything all at once. Within a few years, they started putting tuners in front of the receivers so they could tune to a particular frequency. It was more to null out any annoying other station. So we had those 5 stations go in. In those days, the idea was the higher the station, the better it's going to transmit. So it was on the cliffs overlooking Wreck Beach, on top of Gonzales Hill, on the cliffs over Pachina. Estevan was the odd man out, and it was on the flat plain, almost awash in the ocean. They soon learned that wasn't the case. They figured the stations would only have a radius of about 100 nautical miles, so the stations were spaced about 100 nautical miles apart. To get around the cliffs, they put little tramways down to the beach so they could get supplies in. Interestingly enough, Vancouver radio was out in the boonies. One guy, I think he shot a cougar on the way to work one day. Several miles of bush. So they're relatively isolated. Cape Lazo, there's the community there, Comox. Estevan was really isolated. Pachina was a lighthouse keeper there too, so that wasn't so bad. And of course, the plum position was Victoria and Gonzales Hill. Eventually, they expanded the system. They put one in at Triangle Island, which was basically a hellhole. And they put one in at Ikeda, which was on the lower island in the Queen Charlotte, Moresby Island. And they put one on Digby Island at Prince Rupert. So these stations could all talk to each other. For instance, at Prince Rupert, the town was not very big. I think the guy that promoted Prince Rupert went down to the Titanic. So the station that was there handled all the commercial traffic before the railroad went in, and this telephone or telegraph line. And all that traffic would be hopscotched down the coast to Victoria and then put on the commercial line, the railroad line, over to Vancouver and off down to wherever. All right, that's the chain. It was added to and subtracted from in about 1920. The staffing problems trying to get people to go to Triangle Mountain or Triangle Island was so difficult. They actually shut Triangle Island down and moved the station over to Hope Island, Bull Harbor. And then to fill in what's the name of that strait? Discovery Strait. I can't remember. Anyhow, they put a station in at Alert Bay. And they shut down Ikeda. Oh, there was a station at Dead Tree Point. It was put in about it's end of 1900s for the North Island traffic there. So we had this hopscotch. Prince Rupert, Dead Tree, Ikeda, Triangle Mountain, Estevan, Pachina, Victoria. And by the time end of the 1900s, not 1900s, 1910s, say about 1920, these stations could all talk to each other because the transmitters had been replaced and improved by that time. Now, what does a coast station do? Well, a coast station was put in so that a ship fitted with wireless, and in those days, I think it was 1919, any British flagged ship had to carry a radio officer and a radio station. It was for safety of life at sea. The ships could pass traffic, like if somebody on the ship had a telegram they wanted to send, or ship traffic itself, where the ship was going to be tying up at what time. The radio officer would transmit that stuff, those messages ashore to the nearest coast station, and the message would be relayed down and delivered by teletype somewhere, maybe in Vancouver. Not teletype, landline telegraph, the old did-it type of telegraph. And then the messages would go out that way. The message costs in those days, I looked it up the other day, around in the 1910s, it was, in our money today, it was like $35 for the first 10 words, and it was $31 for the first, $31, that's $23, and 1/10 of that for every word after that. So that's why you always see people, when they send telegrams, try and make them as short as possible. And actually, the telegraph operators would even shorten it up further because they had their own codes in their heads. So you could send ship traffic that way, telegraph. So any passenger on a ship never really felt cut off from friends, relatives, or whatever. It worked wonderfully well. And if there's any distress, the ship could wire, send a message ashore, and get help almost immediately. Tofino Radio and Triangle Mountain, they would get fantastic ranges. Estevan especially, I keep calling it Tofino, but it's Estevan. Estevan moved down to Tofino near the end of its life. Estevan Point, because it was low and almost sitting in swamps, had excellent ground, so the radio there, transmitters radiated tremendously. They could talk to a ship, even with their primitive equipment. This would be about 1920, all the way across to Japan in New Zealand. That was powerful. The coast station itself, while it was sitting listening for somebody calling them, they eventually would do weather observations. They would, they did more than that, weather observations. Well, they send out a traffic list, which is that if somebody had a traffic or a message that wanted to go to a particular ship, they'd send out that ship's call sign, and they'd send this out several times a day. It's called a traffic list. It might be a list of 6 or 7 call signs. So that was the coast station business. Of course, at the first, in the 1908 session, there's very few ships on the coast had transmitters. One of the hang-ups was if you put Marconi equipment on a ship, it came as a package. There's the radio transmitters and equipment, and there'd be a Marconi wireless operator to operate it all. And Marconi had a policy that their equipment only talk to Marconi equipment ashore or another Marconi equipped ship. The West Coast stations were fitted with Shoemaker. Shoemaker was a competing company. And of course, Marconi found out that they couldn't pass traffic. Eventually, Marconi, within a few years, changed their minds and got rid of that policy. It was forced on them, more or less. One of the first ships on the coast to get radio fitted was the Union steamship Camosun. They got fitted, I think it was July 1907 with Marconi equipment, and 11 months later they took it off because they couldn't talk to anybody, which is sort of silly. The steamships plying the coast up and down found that if they had a radio officer on board with his equipment, passengers were more likely to choose them over a ship that wasn't fitted with wireless equipment. And for the simple reason was the safety. There was a problem quite often, ships going aground or disappearing. And with Marconi equipment or anybody's equipment, there'd be communications and help would come immediately. So I've been asked, when was Morse code phased out? Well, Morse code sort of phased itself out. Other forms of communication, ship to shore, came into being. But in the middle or early 1980s, Inmarsat, International Marine Satellite something or other, they placed communications satellite, one over the Pacific, one over the Atlantic, and one over the Indian Ocean. So they had a huge footprint over those oceans. And you could buy equipment that would talk through that satellite to the public telephone system and the public teletype system in the countries where there was earth stations. So eventually, the ships would have a telephone just like you have in your house, or used to have in your house, sitting on the wall, and the ship would have a 10-digit phone number, an area code, and 7 digits. There was an area code for each satellite. So if you knew where your ship was, say in the Atlantic, you just preface the ship's phone number with the particular area code and punch in the last 7 digits, and within a few seconds the phone would ring on the bridge of the ship. If you had traffic to send, you just bang it out on the teletype machine and it would be sent automatically. So what was the radio officer supposed to be doing during this time? He was just a drain on the profits of the ship. So they were all slowly let go. I remember being told at one time there was only one shipping outfit only had one chief engineer, and he sat ashore. And if there was any problem with the ship's equipment, the engineer in charge on the ship, we'd just phone up the engineer and ask him how to fix it. So now that CW sort of died on it. So when the traffic just dropped off, the Morse code traffic dropped off, fewer and fewer messages, and eventually the traffic just disappeared. The last station was, what did I say? It was KPH down in California, and it shut down in the 1998. All right, when the First World War started up, this idea of talking to ships at sea was an obvious military advantage. So the operators of all the ships are drafted into the Navy. I forget what their rank was. So they were all dressed in uniform, which looked sort of odd out in the middle of nowhere. Some of the stations had a guard of a number of men to make sure nobody landed and tried to shoot up the station. One of the stations, they actually were told to dismantle the station and go bury it because they figured it was going to get raided. And one of the operators says afterwards, I wish we hadn't hidden it so well because they had to dig it all up again. But anyhow, no. And after the war was over, these fellows were returned back into Civvy Street, but they found themselves at the bottom of the ladder again as far as seniority went, and that was really a rub salt in the wounds. They spent all that time serving, and when they got out of the Navy, they were worse off than they went into it, which is sad. All right, just to give you an idea of what a ship station was like, I'm going to talk about the radio room on the Camsell. It was the Coast Guard ship Camsell. It was a light icebreaker, which I mentioned before, goes up into the Arctic every summer for 3 months, at least when I was taking it. The radio office was right next to the wheelhouse, and it had Marconi equipment in there. I had a Marconi glow-span transmitter. Marconi always had great names for the equipment. 2 Atalanta receivers, and the glow-span transmitter was CW and phone, and it was put out about 200, 250 watts. It was crystal controlled, and you had about 4 frequencies within each band. In front of the radio operator, he had his 2 receivers. He had an antenna patch panel, because there were several long wire antennas or whips he could switch in depending on how things were going, how propagation was going. Above the patch panel was an antenna. It was called an antenna switching unit, 2 great big knobs. If he wanted to just see how his transmitter was going, he could swing one of the knobs around and have the transmitter go into a dummy load. And there was a light bulb which gave him an idea of how well his transmitter was going out according to the brilliance. If one antenna went down, he could switch the transmitter over to another antenna using that same panel. If the main power on the ship vanished, went for some reason, some problem in the engine room, he had a battery-operated set which ran off a number of wet cells. I think the total capacity was 24 volts DC. And he had a standalone receiver for that. It was all in one panel. There was a receiver which, if I remember right, I think it was crystal controlled for 500, which was the emergency frequency. Anyhow, it was a simple receiver, and it worked well. You had about a 25-watt transmitter, crystal controlled. It would be on 500 kilohertz plus a working frequency. And there was a magic box, which when he was off watch, having lunch or in bed overnight, he could switch into receive mode, and this receiver would listen on 500 kilohertz for the international distress frequency. It wasn't the Morse code one, which everyone's familiar with, the SOS. For this one was a series of dashes, 4 seconds long, 1 second space, repeated 4 times, and then the call sign of the vessel. And if the receiver, that special receiver, heard that sequence of tones, it'd ring a bell in the wheelhouse, in the radio room, and down in the radio officer's cabin. So that would alert him to a distress going on. And that's basically the equipment. Of course, on the Camsell, they had a weather fax machine. Muirhead used wet paper with iodine in it. That was coupled to receiver. And from that, we could get the weather maps from CKN in Aldergrove, and there was a station at Edmonton at a time, too. There was also a couple of, there was one air-ground transmitter for working the ship's helicopter, and there's a series of fixed-tuned HF receivers laterally if we ever had to go up into the high frequencies to get a voice channel. And he also had a little standard ship VHF radio sitting on his desk in front of him just for monitoring channel 16. And that was basically it. When there was an operator by the name of Steve Skura. He was operator for many years on the ship. And in the summertime, we'd take another operator, Joe Cheng. He was an interesting character, and he'd go up every summer too as the second operator. Up in the Arctic, the ship, of course, worked almost 24 hours a day because the sun was up all the time. All right, if you want to see what I've put together so far, the website's Rough Radio, ROUGHRADIO, roughradio.ca. And all my information is there. I try and add bits and pieces every now and again. On my homepage, which is the page that opens up when you go to the site, there's a date code down there, and that gives you an idea of when I actually updated something somewhere on that site. Each page has its own date code, so if I update a particular page, you'll see the date I last updated that page. If you've got relatives or something, you often wonder what happened to them. They went to the West Coast to be a radio operator and disappeared. Take a look, you may find their names there. And if you do, take a look through your old photograph album and send me anything you've got. I've also got an amateur radio call sign, Victor Echo 7, Victor Alpha Zulu. And of course, if you know what the call signs of the coast stations eventually turned into, they're all Victor Alpha something. So I took the one that was at the bottom of the alphabet because I knew it hadn't been assigned anywhere. I'm sort of active, I'm mainly active on the VHF on the island here, especially out of Duncan on the Mount Circuit repeater. But I also work digital up on the 20 and 40 meter bands, and that's where you'll find me occasionally.